So I vowed to destroy the woke mind virus after that.
Elon Musk has fixed his eyes on eliminating the woke mind virus. But what does that mean? Let's go ahead and jump into this video. Shout out to Russell Brand for chopping us up. Check out the video I did reacting to the interview between Georgienko and Russell Brand. I think you'll find it very inspiring.
Why are you willing to make this an issue? Do you think?
I mean, well,
it's sort of like the nameless issue.
It happened to one of my older boys.
Jordan Peterson asked him a very direct question. And I think for us as humans, right, most of the things we see going on in the world, we usually don't get involved. But when it starts to affect those close to you, particularly when we're talking about your kids or your close loved ones, look out. All of a sudden, we are highly motivated to address whatever this is.
Where I was essentially tricked into signing documents for one of my older boys, Xavier. This is before I had really any understanding of what was going on, and we had COVID going on, and so there was a lot of confusion. You know, I was told, oh, Xavier might commit suicide if he.
That was a lie right from the outset. No reliable clinician ever believed that. There was never any evidence for that. And also, if there's a higher suicide rate, the reason is because of the underlying depression and anxiety, and not because of the gender dysphoria. And every goddamn clinician knows that too. And they're too cowardly to come out and say it, right? And so and then we end up in exactly when I saw that lie.
My goal in this video, as we progress, is to look at some of these reports, look at these different perspectives from different journalists, different sites, different studies, and I hope that you'll take a time to think through these things and just consider what is being said and what the evidence seems to point to.
Start to propagate, it just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It's like, I see. So you're telling parents that unless they agree to this radical transformation, that their children are going to die, and you think that's moral, and you think that's true. That is so pathological that it's almost incomprehensible. I can't imagine.
Then the problem is that we've drifted to this moral relativism, right? Jordan Peterson has talked about this in the past. And when it's just a matter of opinion, then who can really say if something is wrong or not? Problem is, we just can't live that way. And those very same people who make the case for moral relativism will be outraged when they perceive some sort of injustice taking place, which only makes sense if objective morality is true. Just can't get away from it.
Anything worse. I can't imagine a therapist doing anything worse than that, or sitting by idly and remaining silent while his colleagues are doing it. It's pathetic.
That's
a strong language there about Jordan Peterson, but honestly, it has to be said, right? Like, at this point, it is what it is. For one, I'm thankful that we're starting to see more and more people be outspoken about this. In one of the articles we're going to look at a lady that used to work at a clinic. Her name was Jamie Reed. He's taking this to, I believe, to Congress. You have the guy that Jordan Peterson sat down with interview not too long ago, Ethan Heim, doctor out of Texas. And it's happening more and more often. Unfortunately, when they do this kind of stuff, they lose their jobs. And it's hard for them to get employment elsewhere.
It's incredibly evil. And I agree with you that people that have been promoting this should go to prison.
It won't stop till that happens.
Yeah.
It'll just go underground. Puberty blockers are being accessed online by kids all the time through non-medical channels. So yeah, right. It's not going to stop. Yeah. Okay, so I see. So that's.
So I was tricked into doing this, it wasn't explained to me that puberty blockers are actually just sterilization drugs. Anyway, and so I lost my son essentially. They call it dead naming for a reason.
Yeah.
This is something that isn't talked about enough. The drugs that they use as puberty blockers are the same drugs they use for SA offenders. We're talking about PDF files. Can't say the word, You get the idea. Now, obviously, you've seen some other reports as of late pertaining with Mr. Beast and his friend that was on there for a while. Um, I'm not saying that this has crossed the line into that yet, but it seems to be leaning, in, at least in the PDF file direction.
All right. So the reason it's called dead naming is because your son is dead. So my son Xavier is dead, killed by the woke mind virus.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that would be like.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and there's lots of people in that situation now.
Right.
It's not pretty, and lots of demolished kids.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's a good reason to be the final straw. All right, so let's.
So I vowed to destroy the woke mind virus after that.
So the sad truth is that this is happening more and more often, and Elon is not the first one to be affected by this and impacted, and unfortunately won't be the last. Obviously, him being more of a high-profile figure and being willing to be outspoken about this topic, I think it kind of moves the conversation forward a little bit more, brings a little more attention to it. I'm not saying everything he says is right. I'm not saying everything he said in the interview is right, but we have to deal with what's happening. So now what I want to do is I want to share a couple snippets from some of these articles that I mentioned earlier. England's National Health Service has stopped prescribing puberty blockers for children and young people with dysphoria or incongruence, saying there is not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty suppressing hormones. This is what Jordan Peterson said in the conversation. In the US, transformer and non-binary youth are twice as likely to have attempted self-deletion compared to other peers. This is from the Free Press. I'm going to include links to the articles in the description of the video. This one, if I'm not mistaken, has to do with a research paper that was done and submitted and accepted, and because of pushback, then it was retracted. No good explanation was given as to why it was retracted. I would encourage you to read the whole article. I'm going to look at a couple of snippets here. Parents observed that after their children socially transitioned, their mental health deteriorated. A small number, 7% of those whose parents answered Susanna's survey, had received medical transition treatment, including drugs to block puberty or cross hormones. Disturbingly, those young people with more emotional problems were especially likely to have socially and medically transitioned. The best predictor of both social and medical transition was a referral to a gender specialist. Some 52% of parents in our study who had received a referral said they felt pressured by the gender specialist to facilitate some sort of transition for their child. Clinicians are supposed to be looking out for the patient. This does not seem to be the case here. This is the article by Jamie Reed, who worked at a clinic for years. Going into it, she thought she was helping. She thought she was doing the right thing. And as she stayed there and as time progressed, things just weren't good. Soon after my arrival at the Transformer Center, I was struck by the lack of formal protocols for treatment. The center's physician co-directors were essentially the sole authority. That's a problem. When I left, there were 50 and about 70% of the new patients were girls. Sometimes clusters of girls arrived from the same high school. This concerned me, but I didn't feel I was in a position to sound some kind of alarm back then. There was a team of about 8 of us, and only one other person brought up the kinds of questions I had. Anyone who raised doubts ran the risk of being called. The girls who came to us had many comorbidities: depression, anxiety, ADHD, eating disorders, obesity. Many were diagnosed with autism or had autism-like symptoms. A report last year on a British pediatric Transformer Center found that about 1/3 of the patients referred there were on the autism spectrum. So here, they kind of referring to Tourette's, and this is kind of like the back and forth. The doctors privately recognized these false self-diagnosis as a manifestation of social contagion. David acknowledged that self-deletion has an element of social contagion, But when I said the clusters of girls streaming into our servers looked as if their gender issues might be a manifestation of social contagion, the doctors said gender identity reflected something innate. So it was social contagion for one thing, but when it was not convenient for them, all of a sudden they want to just ignore it or brush it under the rug. That's not doing what's best for the patient. In this case, not doing what's best for the kids. To begin transitioning, the girls needed a letter of support from a therapist, usually one we recommended, who they had to see only once or twice for the green light. To make it more efficient for the therapist, we offered them a template for how to write a letter in support of transition. The next stop was a single visit to the endocrinologist for a T prescription. That's all it took. So this is on the center that she was working for. This is on their website, right? Left untreated, gender dysphoria has any number of consequences from self to self deletion. But when you take away the gender dysphoria by allowing a child to be who he or she is, we're noticing that goes away. The studies we have show these kids often wind up functioning psychosocially as well as or better than their peers. It's a big claim. Where's the evidence for this? Can be out here just making blanket statements and showing nothing to back it up. There are no reliable studies showing this. Indeed, the experiences of many of the center's patients prove how false these assertions are. And we're going to look at an example here. And it's kind of tough. I'm not going to read the letter here. I'm going to leave it on the screen for a second so you can kind of see it. Biculotamide, is a medication used to treat metastatic prostate cancer. And one of its side effects is that it feminizes the bodies of men who take it, including the appearance of breast. The center prescribed this cancer drug as a puberty blocker and feminizing agent for boys. As with most cancer drugs, biculotamide has a long list of side effects, and this patient experienced one of them: liver toxicity. He was sent to another unit of the hospital for evaluation and immediately taken off the drug. I would encourage you to really go back and look at this article. The stories on here are heartbreaking. There's no other way to really describe it. It's tough to read. Being put on powerful doses of testosterone or estrogen, enough to try to trick your body into mimicking the opposite sex, affects the rest of the body. Wow. Shocker, right? I doubt that any parent who's ever consented to give their kid T, a lifelong treatment, knows that they're also possibly signing their kid up for blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication, and perhaps sleep apnea and diabetes. But sometimes the parents' understanding of what they had agreed to do to their children came forcefully. So this is a parent that's pushing back here. I'm going to show this on the screen. Like I said, these are tough to look at. I'm going to leave it up for a little bit, let you look at it, but strongly encourage, go back and read the full article. Her final report, published last month, concluded that the evidence supporting the use of puberty-blocking drugs and other hormonal medications in adolescents was remarkably weak. On her recommendation, the NHS will no longer prescribe puberty blockers outside of clinical trials. That's important. She's not saying to not do them at all, right? Because this is some of the pushback we're hearing from some people. That's not what she's saying. She's just saying, hey, the evidence is weak. Let's slow it down a little bit. We're giving this out to everybody, and the evidence is not good. We're promoting this as a fix-all kind of treatment, and it's not. In a lot of cases, it's harming these kids. Dr. Cass also recommended that T and estrogen, which allow young people to develop the physical characteristics of the opposite sex, be prescribed with extreme caution. Dr. Cass's findings are in line with several European countries that have limited the treatments after scientific reviews. Let's trust the science, right? This is what the science says. But in America, where nearly 2 dozen states have banned the care outright, medical groups have endorsed the treatments as evidence-based and necessary. That's tough to read. I'm encouraged that at least we see this happening in the UK. And I'm hopeful that eventually this will trickle down to the States. Prayerful that it will. So here she's responding to a question that is being asked pertaining to the AAP and their view on this particular issue. She says, it wouldn't be too much of a problem if people were saying, this is clinical consensus and we're not sure. But what some organizations are doing is doubling down on saying the evidence is good. And I think that's where you're misleading the public. You need to be honest about the strength of the evidence and say what you're going to do to improve it. I suspect that the AAP, which is an organization that does massive good for children worldwide, and I see as a fairly left-leaning organization, is fearful of making any moves that might jeopardize trans healthcare right now. And I wonder whether, if they weren't feeling under such political duress, they will be able to be more nuanced to say that multiple truths exist in this space, that there are children who are going to need medical treatment, and that there are other children who are going to resolve their distress in different ways. I don't agree with the second half of that statement, but this is what she's saying, right? So when it's being presented as she's trying to stop it wholesale, that's not what she's saying. Read the report. WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transformer Health. Okay? So they influence a lot of different places, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, which Dr. Cass mentioned, the American Psychiatric Association, the Endocrine Society, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Well, they seem to have a lot of pull. The WPATH files revealed that WPATH is neither a medical organization nor a scientific organization. The group is engaging in an unregulated experiment on some of the most vulnerable individuals in society. The ethical and legal obligation of securing informed consent is being disregarded, and members show little concern for the potential long-term outcomes of patients. Awareness exists among members regarding the debilitating and potentially fatal side effects of experimental hormone therapies. There is evidence that members know puberty blockers are experimental and that young patients lack a comprehensive understanding of the long-term physical and psychological effects of hormonal and surgical interventions, making cognitive consent impossible. But they're doing it anyway. The files also show that WPATH members are aware that adolescents are developmentally incapable of consenting to procedures resulting in fertility loss, and that WPATH-affiliated doctors are knowingly conducting hormonal and surgical experiments on patients. Moreover, individuals with severe mental health issues are being permitted to consent to invasive, life-altering medical interventions without prior efforts to address their mental distress, violating true, legal, informed consent because the patient's competence is in question. WPATH members are also aware of significant regret among young patients and a distinct lack of health literacy among their patients. So they're aware of this stuff, they're just blatantly ignoring it. Let's look at some examples, right? Some bold claims here, and unlike some of the claims that were being made in the other articles that I showed, kind of particularly the one with Jamie Reed, there's evidence to back this up from the actual doctors that are affiliated with WPATH. Let's look. I'm going to read the top here because this is important, and then we're going to look at some examples. But when gender clinicians and lobbyists think no one is listening, what they say can be quite different and shocking. They make clear they give cross hormones and surgeries to people with limited or no capacity to consent, including people with major mental illnesses and minors. They acknowledge that minors do not understand the long-term consequences of gender affirmation, including sterility. In the Jim Reed article, there's a heartbreaking story about a woman that she was 15 when she went through the procedure, and when she turned 18, she realized, hey, I didn't I didn't really want to do this. And now she wants to go back. And she can't. They discuss extreme body modification surgeries, such as removing genital organs entirely or creating alongside a with no medical justification. All the quotes come from WPATH members in posts on the WPATH members forum or during internal panel discussions. An unethical approach to consent among adults with comorbidities. Patients with dissociative identity disorder are regarded as having the capacity to consent to hormones. This is a quote. One client who had dissociative identity disorder, DID, we worked on all authors giving consent to HRT before it was started. They had authors who were both male and female gender. It was imperative to get all the authors who would be affected by HRT to be aware and consent to the changes. Ethically, if you did not get consent from all authors, you have not really received consent, and you could be sued later if they decide HRT or surgery was not in their best interest. The fact that there's multiple authors in there, like this is supposed to be ethical? Come on. In reply to a nurse practitioner who is struggling with how to handle a patient with PTSD, major depressive disorder, observed dissociations, and schizoid typical traits, who wishes to go on to hormone therapy. I like the fact they include the name of this guy here. I'm missing while you are perplexed. The mere presence of psychiatric illness should not block a person's ability to start hormones if they have persistent gender dysphoria. Capacity to consent and the benefits of starting hormones outweigh the risks. So why the internal struggle as to the right thing to do? Mentally ill and homeless people are regarded as suitable for referring for genital surgery. Talk about taking advantage of the most vulnerable, right? In the scriptures, for us as Christians, we're told to care for the widows and the orphans, right? To care for those that are in need, to help meet their needs, to provide for them. I've also intervened on behalf of people who have been diagnosed with major depressive disorder, CPTSD, homeless, and got at least, in the last 15 years, I have regrettably declined writing only one letter, mainly because the person evaluated was in active psychosis and hallucinated during the assessment session. Other than that, nothing. Everyone got their assessment letter, insurance approval, and are living, presumably, happily ever after. Presumably. So there's no follow-up. This is part of the problem. There's a lack of concern regarding young people regretting sacrificing their fertility. Some of the Dutch researchers gave some data about young adults who had transitioned and had reproductive regret, like regret, and it's there. And I don't think any of that surprises us. Dr. Daniel Metzger. He's not surprised, but he's doing it anyway. Minors offered life-changing interventions they cannot fully understand. Concerning whether it is reasonable to expect children and young adolescents to grasp the effects of gender-affirming care, it is out of their developmental range to understand the extent to which some of these medical interventions are impacting them. They'll say they understand, but then they'll say something else that makes you think, oh, they don't really understand that they're going to have facial hair. Diane Berg. We're often explaining these sorts of things to people who haven't even had biology in high school yet. Dr. Daniel Metzger. Dr. Christine McGinn, American plastic surgeon, reported performing about 20 on patients under 18 over a 17-year period and confessed that not all had perfect outcomes. On the complexity of discussing fertility prevention with children and adolescents during internal panel discussion, it's always a good theory that you talk about fertility preservation with a 14-year-old, but I know I'm talking to a blank wall. They'd be like, ew, kids, babies, gross. I think now that I follow a lot of kids into their mid-20s, I'm like, oh, the dog isn't doing it for you, is it? They're like, no, I just found this wonderful partner and now want kids. So I think, it doesn't surprise me. But you're doing it anyway. Most of the kids are nowhere in any kind of brain space to really talk about fertility preservation in a serious way. Dr. Daniel Metzger. And Dr. Daniel Metzger shows up a lot, huh? An exchange between two doctors about the severe, potentially fatal side effects of testosterone use in little females. 16-year-old female patient found to have 2 liver masses. And the oncologist and surgeon both have indicated that the life-offending agents are the hormones. We are prepared to support the patient any way we can. I have one transition colleague, who after about 8 to 10 years of T, developed hepatocarcinoma, To the best of my knowledge, it was linked to his hormone treatment. It was so advanced that he opted for palliative care and died a couple of months later. So now, what I would like to do is show some clips from an interview between Preston Sprinkle and Paul Eddy talking about this particular issue of detransitioning. So up front, right? We're talking about this whole woke idea, and I have friends on both sides, friends that are kind of like, oh, everything about woke is bad, and I have friends on the other side. They're like, hey, listen, this term has been co-opted to mean something that it never meant, and I'm more on that side, to be honest. They've hijacked the word to mean something that it does not mean. But when we're talking about this particular issue, I understand why it's used. As far as Preston Sprinkle, some people are fans, others are not. If you haven't, Lisa Childers a few months ago, and Christopher Yuan, and I think the other lady's name is Rosaria Butterfield, did a few videos where they did not have nice things to say about Preston and his ministry. To my understanding, Preston reached out to Alyssa and Christopher to try to have a conversation, and neither of them got back to him. He went on to respond to their interview on his channel. Then I would encourage you to check it out if you have strong feelings against Preston. I'm not saying that I agree with everything that he has to say, but I think he does a good job of trying to help in this particular area. And then you have Paul Eddy. So I'm not super familiar with his content, but shout out to Damon Richardson from Urban Logia Ministries, who mentioned that Paul Eddy seems to lean a little on the outside of Orthodox Christianity. So I'm not endorsing his material or his preaching or his teaching or any of that, but he did a ton of research on this particular topic, and I think it's worth looking at some of the clips from the interview because I think they help substantiate what I've kind of run through so far and also support what Elon and Jordan Peterson were saying in their conversation. I will include a link to the full video in the description. Please check out the whole video. It's a great conversation, and they provide a link in that video to some other resources pertaining to the research that Paul Eddy has done on this topic, as well as to a book that he wrote, I think last year, where you have a couple different perspectives, some that are going to be more aligned with a biblical Christianity and some that are going to be more on the progressive side. I have not read it, but I do think it's good to at least read it and see how the other side thinks, right? It'll help in furthering the conversation.
Okay, let's try to depoliticize this conversation so we actually can talk about what's happening on the ground. John Sokoluk, who's one of my great hopes for the future of sexual science, because the dude is like super concerned about the evidence base in sexual science today. He's gone on record as saying that sexual science is probably the most politicized area of scientific research on the planet.
Oh, wow.
Once you realize that, then for any area, dealing with transition and detransition here, you got to suspect that there's some serious political influence on what's happening in the field. No, even though scientists are supposed to be the sector of our society, they're the objective people, right? Disinterested objectivity. It's like, no, we're human beings. And let's just name the politics here. When you talk about gender transition and gender detransition, instantly the politics emerges for this reason. Conservative political forces naturally want to highlight high detransition rates because that does serve the political purpose of making people nervous that we've gone too far with this gender affirmative model. We are transitioning people that will eventually regret it and cannot really undo their medical bodily changes. And so we need to put brakes on this thing, even put some laws in place, right? And on the other side, the affirmative folks know that that's precisely what a conservative perspective will do. And so they run the other side of this and say, we've got to emphasize as much as possible low detransition rates so that we don't have a rollback on the medical possibilities for people who are identifying as transgender. And so it's a pretty obvious problem. You can see why the politics are there. I, in the study, discussed 3 really kind of seismic moments of this.
Yeah.
James Caspian in 2017, just a master's student at a university in the UK, wanted to just do a study on detransition, and the board that verifies or imprimaturs dissertation said no, and in one of their comments said this is a politically incorrect topic.
Yeah.
So this is what we just saw with WPATH. This research said it should be scientific and clinical is being politicized. And I like how he points out how it's being politicized on both sides. Now, I would say one of these sides is caring for the human better than the other. Which side is that? For us as Christians, we believe that humans are made in the image of God. We want to see human flourishing. One of these is against that.
You get ones, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
But so important to know that the first surgical gender transitions are already happening in 1931. All right. That was kind of a major year. And by the 50s, we're talking now, not much in the US. In fact, the US is not till the 60s, but in Europe, in Mexico, interestingly, in Casablanca, Morocco, there are a good number of these things happening in the 1950s, which means in the 1950s, people performing transitions began to have some of their clients come back to them and say, this did not go well. In fact, I'm regretting this, right? So detransition reports start happening by the late 50s at least. By the 1960s, it's becoming enough of an issue that researchers who are trying to do longitudinal analysis of, so how does this go for people once they do, are starting to record, well, for some people it doesn't go so well. In fact, some want to reverse this already in the 1960s. So it's surprising to me how little research is being done when this is a phenomena we've known about and have record of for over 6 decades, right? That's, I think, something we need to account for. Jump ahead, and
this is the problem. If you've had these reports for over 6 decades, why isn't this being studied more in depth? Why isn't it been taken seriously? Why is it that when it gets brought up, people want to ignore it or brush it under the rug or say, oh no, you're trying to advance an agenda? No. You're trying to advance an agenda. We're trying to respond. We want to help. Listen, I get it, right? He mentioned earlier how it's politicized on both sides. Again, one of these sides is not really helping the human. Which side is that?
Part of the turf battle, right? And anyone who even talked about it was just ostracized by most sexual researchers. I think where things have shifted in the last few years is as soon as researchers, particularly in 2021, this is the year with some like 3 or 4 really good studies, turned to the detransition community with some good surveys. And it was reported by them, the detransitioners themselves, when asked, why did you originally transition, that a number of factors were socially influential factors. And once you hear it, not from some researcher that you say has an agenda, but from the community that's being studied, it's more difficult now to dismiss that without being seen as dismissing an entire minority community. And so that's why I think now, with the voices of the detransitioners being finally heard in academically respectable journals, it's an issue we can no longer avoid. And they themselves report that was their experience, that peers who were talking about this, or social media, or being on YouTube. Now, I think we got to be careful, because the impetus for, I think, a lot of Christians is to go, never was anything but external influence.
Right.
You and I have talked about this, Preston, particularly when you were doing your book on transgender experience, that there's a lot of complex data on sort of the etiology questions, like the origins questions. where does gender dysphoria come from?
And I think how he ends here is good, right? We don't want to we don't want to swing the pendulum all the way to the other side, right? It's something we have to wrestle with and research. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist. I'm looking to the experts, to the scientists, to the experts in the field to give me good research, not research that is politicized and leaning one way or the other. And he has something good here because he mentions how this is not coming from the community itself. So now you run the risk. Are you going to ignore this minority community? That goes against everything that's being politically correct for the past, I don't know, 10 years or so. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the church or Christians have gotten it right when we're talking about how we treat the LGBT community. We've gotten it wrong a lot. And honestly, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that in the past, and even, you know what, not even in the past, even now, in some cases, we've done more harm than good. But right now, we're dealing with an issue that's harming kids. And we want to prevent that. So let me grab this book here. Give me a second. Urban Apologetics, Cults and Cultural Ideologies, Eric Mason. There's a couple chapters here by Sharita Lyons, who has a new book coming out, Church Girl. Keep an eye out for that. In the book, Sharita Lyons does a good job of giving some next steps. And she doesn't shy away from how the church has missed it in the past, historically, and in different, in different areas, right? But I want to read what she says here, because I think this is very helpful. The Bible suggests 3 categories: faith, hope, and love. Each of these are distinct, yet they all have some things in common. Instead of responding with anger or frustration or hatred, we should have faith in the testimony of God, hope in the gospel of God, and show love for others in the way God models it for us. We need faith to stand on biblical truth and maintain our convictions in a shifting secular culture. We need the hope of the gospel to remind people that they are loved and accepted by God and in Christ. Not only do they have eternal life, but they can experience abundant life in the present. Lastly, we need the love of Jesus to help us love God, love His word, love ourselves, and love people. We need the love of Jesus to see ourselves rightly and to see others the way Jesus sees them. When some Christians advocate for the church to change and embrace homosexuality or celebrate queerness because it's the 21st century, that is not progressive, it's regressive. There is no faith, hope, and love in offering people an option for life where Christ is not at the center as Savior and Lord. To abuse, abandon, and abhor people is not showing faith, hope, and love. But to accommodate, acquiesce, and retreat from the culture is not a demonstration of faith. It's not a demonstration of faith, hope, and love either. What would it look like if the church, both inwardly and in its outward witness to the world, was marked by faith, hope, and love toward the LGBT community? Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.